Well, we're starting a new project here and a new series of videos. This will be several different videos on this project because, well, it's a really big project. The project is going to be building a trestle across this space right here, which ultimately is going to be a gigantic canyon. The trestle will extend from the right to the left here. On the left, we have the tunnel portal to Alamosa and Schitt Creek, and then all the way to the outside railroad. And then the trestle will cross over to this side, which is the engine shops and the switching yards at Chama. Also, we have the electrical connections here that run from the inside to the outside.
Oh my gosh, is this a bridge over troubled waters, or is this thing going to have some kind of support under it?
Well, it will have a support under it, and hopefully it will also be a bridge over troubled waters.
Oh my gosh.
Or at least the cement floor, which is almost 5 feet below there.
Well, I sure hope you have a plan in mind to keep the trains from falling to their death below. That's like 4 feet tall.
Well, that's going to be in your department to figure out how to keep the trains from falling off of here.
Pillows?
Those aren't pillows.
Well, I was just thinking of a little interior design.
I started off by bending the rails. I'm using Yagas Creek rail, and this is a Yagas Creek rail bender.
I thought it was some sort of a radio.
It looks a bit like one, doesn't it? I defy you to find one of those on eBay or anywhere else. They don't make them anymore, and they're solid gold. That's an amazing tool.
It looks like it.
Because the trestle has a bit of curvature to it, especially coming onto and off of the trestle. And so the first thing I did was bend the rails to fit the situation here, and then I'm going to build the trestle to the pre-bent rails. That way I know that everything's going to line up and be level and square and all of those things.
I sure hope so.
I've always thought that the easiest way to build a big trestle like this is basically to build it upside down, which isn't to say actually build it upside down, but build it from the top down. First build the rails, then attach the ties and the stringers, and just build it from the rails down.
Okay, you didn't attach your head, did you?
So while our goal is going to be to build something that looks like this, first we need to do a little research and actually design the whole thing. So historically, of course, trains have crossed big canyons and valleys and all sorts of things on these massive, massive trestles. Now this trestle right here is a Rio Grande Southern trestle. And this is another Rio Grande Southern trestle. And that's the exact design that I want to duplicate.
Oh my gosh.
Well, Rio Grande Southern really built some dangerous trestles.
Yeah.
So let's start with a basic trestle and a few of the concepts and names of things. Now, of course, at the very top of the trestle are the rails.
Right.
That the trains ride on. Those sit on ties, but they're a different kind of tie. They're a bridge tie, which is a much larger tie than the normal ties that are just laid on the ground. They're taller and they're longer, so they're a much more substantial tie than the usual kind of railroad tie. The ties rest on top of these beams called stringers, and the stringers are bolted together out of taller but somewhat narrower beams by bolting them together into larger beams that makes them stronger. Then notice that these stringers are directly underneath the rails.
Oh.
That way the weight of the train is carried directly down onto the stringers. The stringers set directly on top of what's called the cap, that topmost beam on the leg structures that hold the entire trestle up. Now, the structures that hold the trestle up are called either a bent or a pier. And I find both of those names kind of odd.
Well, especially a bent, because you don't want it to bend.
You don't want it to bend. So maybe there's some logical reason why they called them a bent. But if they're made up out of square beams, they're called a bent. If they're made up out of round pilings, they're called a pier.
So it would appear that your pier is bent?
I hope not.
I hope not.
Now, in our case, we're building bents, and the legs on a bent are referred to as posts. And the two outer posts are angled in this way to prevent swaying. And then the legs in the center, the posts in the center, notice those are directly underneath the stringers in an effort to carry the weight directly down from the rails into the ground.
Wow.
Now these break points, the horizontal elements running down the lengths of the bents are called sills.
Sills?
Sills. And on a model, they're just horizontal boards that we place across there to look like sills. On an actual railroad trestle, those are beams going across there, and each section is a freestanding element, and they're just stacked up. Because the individual sections are only 20 feet high.
Wow.
Now, the very bottom sill is called the mud sill.
Well, obviously. Yeah.
It sits on top of some sort of concrete footing, but yes, down in the mud at the very bottom of the trestle. If these were round pilings, those pilings would be driven into the ground at the bottom, just directly into the mud. There would be no cement footing. Now there are these diagonal braces that crisscross between the sills called sway braces. And there's one on each side of the bent.
Shouldn't they be called anti-sway braces? I mean, would you want your... What?
What? Yeah, let's go with anti-sway braces.
Please.
Now, as we mentioned, what we want to build is a typical Rio Grande Southern trestle, and therefore a typical Rio Grande trestle bent. And notice that they have this extra leg starting with the second sill running at an angle out to the bottom. Helps make it more stable.
Well, it sure looks a lot better.
And that's the real reason we're doing it.
Right.
It looks much cooler.
It does. It looks more stable.
And with a trestle this large, we want it to look stable.
Oh, absolutely, because I see that there's a girt mentioned there. Is that missing off from the bridge they call Gallopin' Gertie?
It could be. I hope not.
I hope not, too.
Anyway, here's the basic design without those extra braces for the Rio Grande Southern of the bents that we're going to be building, and I'm going to construct a jig to manufacture these so that they're all exactly the same shape.
So what's with the little man below? Did he miss his train?
Well, no, I just wanted to put somebody in there so that we can see the scale of the thing.
Oh my gosh, okay, now I'm getting seasick.
Now this is going to be the top, the deck of the trestle, and I needed to figure out exactly where the bents are going to be located. It's 53 inches wide, and it's going to have 5 bents and 2 abutments at either end. So I needed to figure out exactly what the spacing is going to be for that. So we ran down to Home Depot and bought some red cedar. That's what I like to build all of this stuff out of. We can use it outside. This is inside, but I still just like building everything out of red cedar.
Well, it smells good when you're cutting it up, too.
Well, and that's the real reason.
Exactly.
It also looks pretty nice, but it's mostly for the smell. So we actually ran our wood over to Steve's house. He lives in this really cool 170-year-old house.
Yes.
But the upside is he has this really nice woodworking shop down in his basement.
Which reminds me a lot of the one my dad had. It looked just the same.
Wow.
Yes.
I wish we had a wood shop, but we don't really need to wish because, hey, we have access to Steve.
That's right.
And Steve not only has this stuff, he knows how to use it.
Exactly.
And that's key. So the posts we're cutting into 1/2 inch squares so that they will be 1/2 by 1/2 equal on all sides square. And then we're also going to cut our sills and our sway braces, or as you say, anti-sway braces. So we've got a lot of cutting to do here. We bought a tremendous amount of wood, and then we really imposed ourselves on Steve to cut this whole thing up for us. And so there's some part of what we cut up.
Oh boy.
This is what I brought inside the shop to actually start building the trestle with. The vast majority of this stuff is in the shed outside. Now the ties I already have. I had a gentleman cut these for me a couple of years ago. They too are red cedar, and he was selling these on eBay, and so I just had him cut a whole bunch for us. And of course these are the bridge ties, so they're perfectly square and they're much longer than the standard tie. They have a little bit of fuzz to them, so before using them I took a sanding block to them to knock the fuzz level down. And then they're in these little packages of 50 bridge ties to a bundle all wrapped up in saran wrap. But that's what they look like once they're all sanded and ready to go in place. Back to our Rio Grande Southern trestle here. Notice how closely spaced they are.
Right.
They're almost touching, and then there are fire barrels every so often, and I want to recreate the fire barrels, so I've also got some very long bridge ties for putting a platform out here to hold my fire barrels.
That's really cool.
Now I've got these tie plates that I cast up, but they're kind of an unusual tie plate. They're a 3-hole tie plate that are kind of larger on one side than the other, and I don't really want to use them. I don't think those look good on the bridge. Mm-mm. I think most tie plates that you see are a 4-hole tie plate that are symmetrical. And so I wanted to find some tie plates that I could use for that, and our friend Dave at Ozark Miniatures offers just such a thing. He offers both styles of tie plates. So I ordered 400 of these tie plates, ended up using 200 of them on the trestle. But notice they're perfectly symmetrical with 4 holes to the plate. It's going to look much, much better.
Oh, much. I like those.
So there's the look of these when they're in place. And so I painted a bunch up, and we'll pre-paint them before putting them on the trestle. It's just much easier than trying to paint them after the fact.
Right.
These trestles are all bolted together with these gigantic bolts, and typically I would use a nut bolt and washer casting, or at least that's what you would normally use on a model trestle. But I like to use actual nut bolts and washers.
Right.
For one thing, when you're working outside, you don't have to worry about your glue joints coming apart. And I just like the look and feel, and I like, frankly, bolting my trestle together.
Absolutely.
So I searched all over the place to find an appropriate bit of hardware. I found these on Amazon, but the price was obscene, so I continued shopping. But this is what I'm looking for. Looking for this in a smaller size. You found some of these in a 4mm.
I did.
And those have worked out really good. And then I also found some 440s. I'll put a link in the description to both of these sizes. But that's what we're bolting the whole thing together with. And then we started hoarding hardware. We ended up using over 1,200 pieces of hardware.
That is just unreal.
On this bridge. So I set the deck in place here with just the bent rails, no ties, and then I precariously drove number 34 to the edge out here. But I just wanted to make sure everything was in alignment, not proceed past this point. But the rails just go across there, and now I'm going to construct my stringers directly on top of these pre-bent rails so that I know that the stringers line up perfectly with the rails. Again, the technique here is building, sort of like building it upside down, starting with the rails and then building the stringers, and then attaching the ties to the stringers, and then spiking the rails to the ties. Now, because the two stringers are virtually identical, I simply took my wood for the second stringer and laid that alongside the existing stringer so that I know they're exactly the same. And then I took little blocks of wood and I put little blocks of wood between the two stringers to hold them in perfect square this way. That you wouldn't have that on a real trestle, but just for the sake of keeping everything square and level, I put those little spacers in there. And now I'm ready to start gluing my ties onto the stringers, making sure that those are absolutely perpendicular to the stringers using a little square here. Now I've also got these very long ties, which will be the fire barrel platforms.
Oh, neat.
And they're these are actually cast plaster fire barrels. And I found those at a train show. I was just going around the train show, and this guy was selling plaster castings that he made up. And he had several different things, but I fell in love with his barrels. Morse Productions, unfortunately, no longer in business.
Well, because I can turn worry into an Olympic event, I decided you needed some kind of a railing on there just to keep the train from falling to the floor.
Well, and a lot of trestles did have railings to keep people from falling to their death in the river or whatever. And so what I did is I took some of these switch ties. That's a standard size tie, so you can see it's not nearly as tall, but they're really long. And then I'm going to attach metal railings to these ties. And that should keep even a heavy brass engine from falling to its death if it derails.
Oh, literally. I can't imagine the loss in money if it were to do that.
And you can see here that those switch ties are mounted directly on top of those little spacers, which are directly on top of where the trestle bents are going to be. That gives me a really, really firm attachment for my railings in case a heavy brass engine does run into those things. Now I used a little strip of plastic ties here, Yagas Creek ties on the Yagas Creek rail, just to keep everything in gauge and alignment. Those will be cut away once everything's spiked down to the trestle. Okay, now to start attaching the actual ties to the stringers. Those are just going to be glued on there with alphatic resin. And the trick here is making sure that the spacing is all uniform and that they're all perfectly square to the stringers. So I actually constructed a little jig to do that because there's several hundred of these ties to put on here. So here's my technique. I put a little daub of yellow glue, alphatic resin, and then followed that up with a little teeny daub of the medium thick Instacure glue. Those two things get along really well together.
Oh, way too well, and sometimes you can't get them apart.
And then that way this will set up very rapidly. Once I set this in place, then I can come in with my little jig and make sure that everything is spaced correctly and is perfectly square. And that's the little jig that I created right there.
Well, that's how you do that. Wow, just don't get the jig glued in there.
Yeah, don't glue that in place. But you can see all it is a little T-shaped piece with the exact right spacing for the ties, and then the T keeps everything square, and I can just go merrily down the stringers putting ties in place.
Well, and that's how you do that. Wow.
Went really quickly. So there's one last thing that needs to be done to the deck here before I actually start spiking the rails in place, and that's the outer guardrail.
Oh.
They use these on the Rio Grande Southern and a lot of other railroads as well, but it's just a small piece of wood at the very end of the ties to keep something from falling over the edge if an errant derailment were to happen and a wheel to find its way over here. It's just some minor bit of protection to keep things from falling off the edge.
Well, plus it looks good.
That's the real reason for doing it, is it looks really neat. I also went ahead at this point and built the decking for the fire barrels on the ends of the long ties. Now, the guardrails are going to be attached with these nails. We found these somewhere, and I just cut them down so that they're not hanging through the bottom.
Oh, dear.
And then just drill a hole and drop them in place. It's just one of those lovely little details that really jumps out at you and looks really cool.
Well, it does. I'm glad you cut those points off because, people have been asking about the railroad, and I could just say, well, you got hung up.
And there's the completed deck, ready to have the rails spiked down. So before spiking them down, I took them outside and shot some rust color on them, cut away the plastic ties that don't need to be there, and now I'm ready to start spiking everything in place using, of course, my tie plates, which I've already prepared, because everything's going to be mounted to a tie plate. This is, of course, a little bit tedious because there are 4 spikes per tie. It ends up taking quite a bit of time.
That's when you hum, I've been working on
The railroad. Well, and actually, this is funner.
It's fun. You get your deep thinking done while you're doing that.
I don't know. I love some of these really tedious jobs. To me, they're just the funnest ones.
That's where you get your thinking done.
Yep. Now this is the tool that I use for driving in spikes. It's just a pair of needle nose. I think these are a Walther's tool. I think so. Anyway, I've had them for years and years and years. You can see they're a bit beat up.
I just thought that groove was worn in there because you use it a lot through the years.
That's actually a groove that's milled right in there to hold the spike nice and square so you can push it in without the whole thing spinning around and going into your fingernail instead of the tie.
It's not from frequent use then.
No. So here we are about, 20 hours into the I don't think quite that much. This was rather slow and tedious, but look how cool that is.
It's wonderful.
And now I'm using 2 different gauging tools. These are from Micro Engineering, and I like them because they just snap in place and they'll hold the rails in gauge mostly, but for the real accurate where I'm actually spiking, then I use my Yagas Creek gauge, because that really holds them in accurate gauge. Now, at either end of the trestle, I'm leaving the Yagas Creek plastic ties in place because that's actually what holds this whole thing in place, are the plastic sections that overlap onto the road bed, and so I want to use those nice strong plastic ties there. Anyway, 50 ties and 100 tie plates and 200 spikes later, I finally had my deck all spiked.
Oh, there you go.
And I'm ready to put 2 more rails down.
Oh,
so here we go with another 200 spikes. Because just inside the running rails are more guardrails. These are actual rails. They're a smaller size rail, but again, they would use these on trestles and bridges in case of a derailment to keep the wheels from jumping over the rail and the whole car from tumbling off the bridge.
right.
Then at either end of the deck, the guardrails come to a point out over the plastic ties just to act as a taper there in case of an errant derailment again. And now to stain the deck. I'm using this Watco Danish wood oil, and again, I just love the smell of it.
Yes,
It fills the whole shop, makes everything smell like furniture.
it does.
But mostly, of course, it just looks really neat.
It sure does.
I use a mixture of the dark walnut and the natural, and then I can kind of use a little of one and a little of the other to get a non-uniform finish on the whole thing, darker in some areas and lighter in some areas, which gives it a natural weathering and just a nice natural look to the whole thing.
Wow, that looks pretty.
And doesn't it turn out nice?
It sure does.
Then, of course, rolling the whole thing over and getting the bottom side. No one will see the bottom side, but that's not the point.
Well, you never know who's going to see the bottom side.
Yeah, you might be laying on the floor looking up going, what
happened here? Yeah.
But mostly it's just, if you're going to do a thing, do a thing.
Exactly.
So, of course, I wanted to make sure that the bottom side was equally weathered and stained and just looked really nice. Because for one thing, it's just fun.
It is.
Then another thing I like to do is come back and do a little light sanding as I'm oiling all this stuff. Again, it helps give it a more weathered appearance. A little less uniform and just looks a little bit more like it's been stomped around and trains driven across it and the elements have been acting on it. So I'll put a little oil on and then a little sanding and then a little oil on and then a little sanding.
Right.
I just think it has a great look.
It sure does.
Naked out on Main Street. And there it is, the finished deck.
It sure looks nice.
Yeah, I think we're finally ready to move on to building bents.
Oh, gee, that's a lot of work.
That's a lot of work. That will, of course, be a future show. I did want to, just for fun, set this in place and just pull a train slightly out. I'm not courageous enough to...
No.
It's strong enough that I'm sure it would hold a train up, but I'm not going to tempt fate.
No.
For one thing, the railings aren't on it, and for another thing, there are no bents underneath it.
No.
But I did have to pull the locomotive out there just to take some neat pictures.
It looks cool. Very cautiously cool.
Yes. Ready to move on now to building bents. So if you're not a subscriber to the channel, you'll want to make sure you are a subscriber to the channel so that you can follow along with the rest of this construction. Also, you might want to mash the like button if you liked this video. But if you want to become a subscriber, the easy way to subscribe is with the upcoming blue button. Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Tuesday. We'll see you then.
Bye.
Bye-bye.